As we saw in the previous episode, the Persians had invaded Greece because the Athenians had not only sworn fealty to the Persians by giving them earth and water, but they had also revolted against Persian rule and burned down their regional capital of Sardis in Asia Minor. Understanding that they were really in for it, the Athenians and Spartans decided to send envoys out to any Greek power that would help them. One of these powers was the greatest Greek city in Sicily, called Syracuse. Now, Syracuse might well at this time have been the most powerful Greek city, full stop. Herodotus tells us that the Syracusan army was colossal for a Greek city, a single Greek city-state, with 2,000 horsemen, 20,000 men-at-arms, presumably hoplites, thousands of light infantry and archers and slingers, and a fleet of 200 ships. By way of comparison, the most powerful land army in Greece was, of course, the Spartans, who had around 10,000 Spartan hoplites, Spartiates, and the most powerful naval power in Greece was Athens, with 180 ships. Syracuse was a supremely powerful state, and it was under an able general. Gelon had spent years building up Syracuse. After gaining control of it, he would raise other townships and bring the population to Syracuse to swell its numbers, at least with the wealthier aristocratic folk, and to help fill his coffers he simply sold the poor folk into slavery, because he found them disagreeable to live with. If there's one thing we should really keep in mind about Gelon, is that he was particularly Machiavellian, and there was absolutely a payoff for this kind of Machiavellian attitude. He had made Syracuse the most powerful state in the Greek world, and now the old guard of Athens and Sparta had come to him to ask for help, and he was in a position to dictate the terms to them. Herodotus records a very interesting interaction between Gelon and the Athenian and Spartan envoys, and like all of these things, we can never really be sure that they happened, but as Napoleon quipped, history is a set of lies agreed upon, so let us agree upon these lies and carry on. So the Athenian and Spartan envoys come to Gelon, and they try to persuade him that it is in his best interests to come to the aid of mainland Greece, by assuring him that the Persians will not simply stop at Athens and Sparta, but they will in fact come for the entire western Mediterranean. It's as good an attempt at persuasion as any, and very much reminiscent of the "first they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist" line of argument, but for the envoys from Athens and Sparta, maintaining the ancient dignity of these two great and famous Greek states was very important. Syracuse was a colony of Corinth and Tanea, which were Dorian Greek cities, the same as the Spartans, in contrast to the Athenians, who were Ionians. It was probably not expected by the Spartan emissaries that the Dorian Corinthian colony of Syracuse would attempt to usurp the command of the Greek forces in Greece from the Spartans. They probably expected a great deal of deference and respect to come from the Syracusans, if by no other reason than the venerable nature of Spartan power. And when it came to the Athenians, this was the same thing. Though not Dorians but Ionians, the Athenians claimed to be autochthonous. They claimed to be sprung from the soil of Attica, and had never moved from the place that they have originally come from. Such ancient and prestigious lineages, compared to the city of Syracuse, which was founded in around 734 BC, would expect naturally, based on their antiquity, to take control of these forces, whereas Gelon and Syracuse was looking at his temporal position and contemporary army and thinking, well, I am the most powerful force here. Why should I not be in charge? Gelon chastises the Spartans and the Athenians for not coming to his aid in times of need, but, and probably because he was very much one of Machiavelli's princes, Gelon says that he will not make an example of them, and he was ready to send to their aid 200 triremes, 20,000 men-at-arms, 2,000 horsemen, 2,000 archers, 2,000 slingers, and 2,000 light-armed men to run with the horsemen. A colossal Greek army. Given the imminent danger from the Persians, this must have seemed like a very tempting prospect to the emissaries, but they undoubtedly literally could not agree to the condition that Gelon would be made the supreme commander of the Greeks. And honestly, I'm not really surprised. The Spartans and the Athenians were undoubtedly aware that to bring in such a powerful Greek state to assist them would make them reliant on them, and assuming that the Persians were defeated, by what means were they going to force Gelon to leave Greece after he had helped defend it? It's entirely possible that Gelon was acquiescing to this request of help and attempting to impose this condition because he knew that if he helped them win the war against the Persians, he would have a commanding influence in Greece. Of course, Spartan pride could not allow the Syracusans to have overall command of the Greek forces. And it's very interesting that Gelon then tried to negotiate with them. He tried a compromise. He said, okay, well, if you want to be commanders of the land forces, I accept that, and I will take command of the naval forces, since I have the most powerful individual force of any Greek state, which is, of course, where the Athenians decided to intervene and say, no, we have command of the naval forces, because under Themistocles, Athens had become the most powerful Greek mainland naval force. In case I hadn't mentioned it, this was due to the discovery of silver mines in Attica, and when the mines were discovered, it was debated as to what would be done with all the silver. And initially it was proposed to simply distribute it to the population, which I'm sure everyone would have been very, very happy for. But Themistocles could see that war with Persia was brewing, and he persuaded everyone, somehow, to instead spend the money on building a navy, which is why Athens was in such a favourable position come the Persian War. Gelon pushes his position because he knows he's got a lot of bargaining power at this point, but the Athenians and Spartans refuse to budge, and so he lets them leave without any help whatsoever. And in fact, he sends 3 ships to follow them and to monitor what the situation in Greece and what happens against the Persians. And on these ships he includes a token of earth and water and money to give to the Persians to submit to them in the event that the Greeks lose, to prevent the Persians from sending armies to Sicily to conquer him. I have no idea whether or not Gelon was actually aware that this was one of the mistakes the Athenians had made, but who knows. Either way, no aid was forthcoming from the Syracusans, and so the envoys returned home. So at the same time that Xerxes had reached Thermopylae and was engaging with Leonidas, the Persian navy was engaging with the Greek fleet at Artemisium. Herodotus is rather specific about the numbers of the Greek and Persian ships that made up the respective fleets. The Phoenicians and Syrians donated 300 to the Persian navy, the Egyptians 200, the Cypriots 150, the Cilicians 100, the Ionians 100, Pontus 100, Caria 70, Aeolia 60, Lycia 50, Pamphylia 30, Dorians from Asia Minor contributed 30, and the Cyclades Islands donated 17 to the Persian navy, for a total of 1,207 ships. In comparison to this, Herodotus says that there are 280 ships in the Greek fleet at Artemisium, but his numbers only come to 271, with 127 of those being Athenian, 40 of them being Corinthian, 18 from Aegina, 20 from Chalkis, 20 from Megara, 12 from Sicyon, 10 from Sparta, 6 from Epidaurus, 7 from Eretria, 5 from Trozen, 2 from Styria, 2 from Chios, and 7 from Locris. If these numbers are accurate, and apparently ancient sources are quite consistent on this point, then the Greek fleet is outnumbered by more than 4 to 1. The reason that the Persians and the Greeks were contesting for Artemisium was quite simple. The Allied fleet had to prevent the Greeks at Thermopylae from being surrounded, and that meant preventing the Persian fleet from landing, as the Persian fleet was carrying something like 30,000 marines, and given that there were only 7,000 Greeks at Thermopylae meant that had they been surrounded they would have been easily overwhelmed. And so what the Greeks had to do is simply hold off the Persians and prevent them from being able to disembark to the rear of the Spartans. As with the Battle of Thermopylae that took place concurrent to the Battle of Artemisium, the battle lasted for 3 days, and you might think that the Allies would simply have no chance whatsoever against such a large fleet, but some clever tactics and frankly some remarkable luck would actually really help them out. Before the Battle of Artemisium could even begin, the Persians sailing across had encountered a storm near the coast of Magnesia and lost around 400 of their 1,200 ships, putting the size of their fleet little more than 3 times the size of the Greek fleet. During the first day of the Battle of Artemisium, the Greeks decided to try to negate the superior Phoenician seamanship by sailing out and forming what I can only imagine was a schiltron with their ships. Now, this probably wasn't a complete circle, which is what the schiltron was, with pikes facing out in various directions, but it was probably more of a crescent or a horseshoe shape, where the Greek ships would array themselves side by side with their armoured prows pointing outwards, to create, I guess, what could be roughly approximated to be a phalanx with ships. It of course had to bend around because the Persian navy did outnumber the Greeks by such a large amount. However, it was probably only slightly more than 2 to 1, as what the Persians decided to do is break off a detachment of around 200 of their 800 ships and send them around the island of Euboea to fully encompass the Greeks and just get them on all sides. However, this 200 ship detachment was smashed against the rocks of Euboea in another storm, so the Persians have lost half of their fleet before it has even engaged. So the 271 ships at Artemisium for the Greeks only had to deal with 600 ships. Now, don't get me wrong, that's still a remarkable number, but obviously it would be much more preferable to deal with 600 ships than 1,200 ships. And the Greeks had some interesting tactics that I'm sure the Persian navy had not encountered up until this point, because as the Persian navy was encircling the Greek fleet, the Greeks attacked. They sailed out and captured or sunk around 30 ships, putting the Persian navy in disarray. Night put an end to the encounter and the Greek fleet sailed back to Artemisium, presumably ecstatic by how the day had gone. During the second day of the battle, the Persian fleet effectively spent the time licking its wounds and attempting to make their fleet seaworthy again. Any morale that they were clawing back must have really been stripped away quite quickly after learning about the loss of the 200 ships to the storm, and the fact that another 53 ships had arrived from Athens to reinforce the Greek fleet. Because of the reluctance of the Persians to come out and fight, the Allies took the opportunity to attack Cilician ships on patrol, destroying them. It was a minor victory, but something, again, to knock down the Persian morale, before retiring on the second day. On the third day, the Persian fleet set out to completely destroy the Greek fleet, again trying to encircle them. The Greeks went out to meet them with probably very little in the way of fear, and once again there was a day-long battle, and the Allies were as hard-pressed as the Persians at this point. Again, nightfall put an end to the engagement, and when the fleet separated, they discovered that both sides had roughly equal losses of around 100 ships each, which, I mean, again, is terrible for both sides, but it's much worse for the smaller Greek fleet. Half of the Athenian ships had been damaged or lost. Had the battle gone on for a fourth day, the Persians would have undoubtedly defeated the Greeks at Artemisium. However, a messenger arrived from Thermopylae to let them know that the allied Greek army had been wiped out trying to defend the Hot Gates, and so that there was no more strategic value in defending the Straits of Artemisium. The Persian fleet then met up with the Persian army and then continued to sack their way down towards Athens, while the Greek fleet retired to Salamis to try and assist with the evacuation of the remaining Athenians, some of which stayed behind on the Acropolis of Athens, behind a wall of wood, as the Delphic oracle had predicted, to attempt to defend Athens from the Persians. When the Persians arrived at Athens, seeing it all but deserted other than the few defenders on the Acropolis, they took it and burned it to the ground, and killed all of the remaining defenders. As the allied fleet sailed around to Salamis from Artemisium, Themistocles decided to leave inscriptions to the Ionian Greeks on the rocks there that they would see, asking them to, if they couldn't defect from the Persian navy, to at least not fight very well come the day. While the Spartans were busy barricading the isthmus to the Peloponnese to prevent the Persian army from simply marching down there, the Greek naval commanders didn't have a set strategy to deal with the Persians, many arguing in favour of a defensive strategy involving blockades, but Themistocles' powers of persuasion must have been incredible, because once again, instead of offering them a defensive and safe way of trying to fend off the Persians, he instead argued again that they should go on the offensive, specifically to cripple the Persians' naval support for their vast land army, to allow the Greeks to gain superiority at sea and at least defend the remaining population that had been evacuated to Salamis. Athens evacuated its citizens to Salamis after Thermopylae, and shortly before the Persian army captured Attica and Athens itself, which was deserted save for a small remnant of citizens who had built a wooden wall atop the Acropolis. This was before the Parthenon had been built, so they weren't attempting to protect that, but instead attempting to fulfill a prophecy from the Pythia at Delphi. The prophecies from Apollo's oracle had been inconsistent on the subject of the Persian invasion, but mostly erring on the side of flee now because everybody is going to die. However, when pressed, the oracle said, "A wall of wood alone shall be uncaptured, a boon to you and your children." Themistocles interpreted this as the Athenian navy would be the saviour of Athens, which is how he persuaded the Athenians to pour their new wealth of silver into the endeavour. After Thermopylae and with the Persian host advancing towards Athens, the navy did indeed save the citizenry from the Persians. However, you'll always have a few contrarians who interpret things differently, and when the Persians arrived in Athens, they easily destroyed the wooden wall atop the Acropolis and its few defenders, and they then destroyed the now empty city. Xerxes then decided to march his army to the Peloponnese, but first he calls a council of war. He assembles the monarchs he rules over, and then has Mardonius ask each one whether they think that they should attack the Greek fleet assembled at Salamis. All of them reply yes, except Queen Artemisia of Caris. Caris is a region of Anatolia under Persian rule, and its biggest city being Halicarnassus, the place where Herodotus was originally from, and where a Persian satrap called Mausolus had his fabulous tomb built. Artemisia points out that all of the advantages are for the Persians. They have the manpower and numbers by land and sea, they have subjugated all of Greece except for the Peloponnese, including taking and destroying Athens, which was the primary goal of the expedition itself, and with this superiority it seems to her that the Greeks cannot hold out for long. So, was she correct? Well, the Greek land forces were busy fortifying the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow bridge of land connecting the Peloponnese with the rest of mainland Greece. This isthmus is about 4 miles wide, so the Spartan-led land forces decided to build a wall across it to prevent the Persian advance. However, the entire Athenian population is now on the island of Salamis, and would be stranded and defenceless if Athens were to lose her navy, and this probably provided a kind of anchor point to which the Athenians felt obliged to stay and defend. After Thermopylae, the Persians were naturally wary of a frontal assault against a fortified Greek position, and so Xerxes desired to bring his navy around behind the Greek forces, as he had attempted to do at Thermopylae and resulting in the Battle of Artemisia, to flank them. Xerxes' army was still colossal, and far greater than anything the Greeks could ever hope to match in the field, and at 4 miles long the isthmus wall probably would not have been defensible for very long, regardless of whether the navy could be brought around to outflank them. However, time really wasn't on Xerxes' side. He had been away from Persia for months, and there's always the risk that a usurper would try and steal the kingdom from you in absentia. And not only that, keeping such a large force supplied is no mean feat, and his supply lines would have forever been at risk as long as the Greek fleet was intact. So there are plenty of reasons for the Persians to not want to dally. And it's difficult to ignore the fact that we know the result of the campaign when trying to assess the soundness of Artemisia's advice. At the time it must have seemed absurd that the Persians wouldn't win, from the Persian perspective. Given the perpetual disparity in numbers, with all of the advisors except one recommending engaging and destroying the Greek fleet to gain mastery of the seas, which certainly would have ensured an easy conquest of the Peloponnese, it's hard to see the argument against attacking the Greeks at Salamis. But Artemisia does make a good point that the Greeks doubtless couldn't have stood up to the Persian advance indefinitely, and she's probably right that the Persian navy could have just circumvented the Greek navy, and remained secure in its size and open waters to render their opponents tactically useless. The Greeks wouldn't have been able to assault the Persian navy and hope to prevent it from landing its troops on the far side of the Isthmus of Corinth So, other than protection of the Persian supply lines, the only reason I can see for the Persians entering in such a compact and unfavourable battle as the Battle of Salamis was the feeling of security of having eradicated the Greek fleet, or their own wounded pride that the Greeks had withstood so firmly thus far. If the Greeks can't prevent you from carrying out your plan, and they can't attack you while you're in open waters, why bother dealing with them? Either way, Xerxes decided that since the overwhelming majority of his advisors were encouraging him to attack the Greek fleet, it must have been because that he personally was not watching over the Battle of Artemisium that the Persian fleet had fared so poorly. You might think this a tad egotistical, but we are dealing with a man who is effectively king of the world, with armies of sycophants and a rather distorted view of himself. After all, he did have the Hellespont, a body of water, whipped for being disobedient. Xerxes gave orders for the Persian army and fleet to begin the march, the army towards the Peloponnese and the navy towards Salamis. The 7 tribes of the Peloponnese had been united by the Persian threat, and had flocked to the isthmus in their tens of thousands to help build the wall after the defeat at Thermopylae. They toiled unceasingly to build the wall because, frankly, they didn't think the Greek fleet stood a chance of resisting at Salamis. Unlike the land army at the isthmus, the Greek fleet at Salamis was not of one mind. The fleet was nominally under the control of a Spartan nobleman called Eurybiades. However, the real tactical brilliance was demonstrated time and time again by the Athenian noble Themistocles. Eurybiades wanted the Greek fleet to abandon its position in the Straits of Salamis and retire to the isthmus to support the land army there. However, Themistocles better understood that the terrain at Salamis provided the Greeks with a force multiplier, and was eminently more advantageous to them, and disadvantaged the Persians in the same way that Thermopylae had done. The Greek camp split into 2 factions based roughly on geography, with those from Attica and its surrounding areas wanting to fight the battle where they stood, and the Peloponnesians wishing to retire. Themistocles believed that the Peloponnesians would carry the vote, so he devised a cunning stratagem. He sent a slave to the Persian fleet with a message to tell them that Themistocles was actually a sympathizer for the Persians and wished for them to be victorious. The slave was instructed to inform the Persians that the Greeks were terribly afraid of the Persians and were on the verge of flight, and that it would be in the Persians' best interests to prevent them from escaping. For reasons unknown, the Persians decided to believe this bold-faced pack of lies, and sent a large detachment of ships around the western coast of Salamis under the cover of night, while landing around 400 troops on the nearby islet of Citolea. The Greek navy knew none of this, and the following morning Aristides the Just, a political opponent of Themistocles, who had been ostracized from Athens, arrived with news that the Greeks were now surrounded, and that the retreat to the isthmus was impossible. Aristides had a glowing reputation, and it's likely that if it was anyone else they probably wouldn't have believed him. Upon daybreak, the Persian fleet sailed into the narrow straits under the watchful eye of Xerxes, who had taken up a position on the hills overlooking the straits, so he could watch his navy in action. The Greek navy put out early to engage the Persians, and were attacked by them, and unfortunately the narrative of events becomes confused and hard to follow. The Corinthian contingent may or may not have fled to the north, only to turn around and engage the Persians. If this did occur, it might have been a feigned retreat, or it might have been that the Corinthians were in actual flight and rallied, or it might not have occurred at all. The Straits of Salamis are very narrow, at some points less than 500 meters wide. Needless to say, this gives very little room to maneuver for 1,000 ships, and the Persian navy found itself confused and floundering under the weight of its own numbers. They had expected to catch the Greeks in a disorganized retreat, only to find them well formed and ready for battle. Taking advantage of this confusion, the Greek navy forced the first line of Persian vessels back into the space occupied by their reinforcements. Early on in the battle, Xerxes' brother, the admiral of the Persian fleet, was slain leading the Phoenicians against the Athenians on the western side of the line, causing the Phoenicians to rout and many of their ships run aground on the shore. This was the beginning of the end for the Persian fleet, with Queen Artemisia being one of the few captains to distinguish herself. Herodotus reports that confusion spread throughout the whole Persian fleet, and that Artemisia's ship was retreating while being hotly pursued by an Athenian vessel. We do not know if this was her plan, but Artemisia rammed a friendly vessel, which made the Athenian ship in pursuit presume that she was an ally and break off chase. This in turn was spotted by Xerxes, who thought that she had just sunk an enemy ship, causing Xerxes to lament, "My men have behaved like women, and my women like men." The Greek line broke through the disorganized Persian line in the centre, and the rout of the Persian navy began. The Greeks gave chase and captured or sank many vessels, to the great loss of Persian life, mostly through drowning, as they apparently, unlike the Greeks, did not know how to swim. The Greeks who found their vessels capsized simply swam the few hundred meters to the shore. The Persian navy fled towards Phalerum, an occupied town on the Attic coast, only to be ambushed by the Egetanaeans, resulting in massive casualties for the Persian navy. Actual numbers are unknown, but it's likely to be hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men in total. As the Greeks mopped up the Persian navy, Aristides the Just took a detachment of hoplites to Citylea to destroy the Persian garrison there. The remnants of the Persian fleet broke up, with the largest contingent, the Phoenicians, limping back to Asia as Xerxes fumed. Back in Sicily, Gelon must have been thanking his lucky stars he had not agreed to give the mainland Greeks aid, as on the same day as the Battle of Salamis, the Carthaginians invaded, with a force apparently numbering some 300,000 men, drawn from the western Mediterranean. This army was met by Gelon's experienced Syracusan army, as well as allies, allegedly numbering around 50,000 men. The sources for the battle are Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, the first separated from events by distance, and the second separated from events by time. They both give differing accounts of the battle which cannot be reconciled, and so I won't try. Though the numbers are certainly inflated, there is no doubt that it was a significant Carthaginian invasion force, and that there was a distinct threat to the Greek cities of Sicily, and that it was defeated by Gelon and Theron. The question remains, however, was this invasion the result of a conspiracy? There's no evidence to prove that it was, but the timing of the attack suggests that some coordination took place, and given that Carthage was a colony of Phoenician cities from the Lebanese coast, it's entirely possible that this was part of a coordinated effort to conquer the Greek world. Alas, we shall probably never know, but it does make for interesting speculation. So although the Greek cities of Sicily are safe, and the Persian navy has been neutralized, the second Persian invasion of Greece is not yet over. Xerxes still remains in control of the largest land army ever to have entered the country, and is marching on Sparta.